husband smiled as if he had already won. We were sitting around our dining room table in Columbus, Ohio. Our daughter Jennifer was on his left. Our son Brandon sat across from me.
No one
For the third time
will
that night,
believe her.
Richard Cole shook his head and sighed dramatically. "Sheila," he said, leaning back in his chair, "no one is going to believe that." The room fell silent. Jennifer wouldn't look at me. Brandon looked concerned instead of angry, which somehow hurt even more.
I'm telling you, I didn't mean for it to
After
happen.
34 years of marriage, my husband
knew
had
the money
convinced
was stolen,
everyone that
didn't
I
you,
was
Dad?
confused, emotional, and losing touch with reality. What he didn't know was that I had something in my pocket, a recording, and in less than 60 seconds, his entire life was about to collapse. Before I tell you what happened, I'd love to hear from you. If this story touches you in any way, please like and subscribe so we can continue these conversations together. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had a moment when no one believed you, even though you were telling the truth also? Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I'd truly love to read your stories. If you had met my husband 35 years ago, you probably would have liked him immediately. Most people did. Richard Cole had the kind of smile that made people trust him. He was confident without appearing arrogant, intelligent without sounding condescending, and charming enough to make anyone feel important during a conversation. At least, that's what everyone believed. For most of my adult life, I believed it too. My name is Sheila Cole. I'm 62 years old, and until recently, I thought I knew the man I'd spent 34 years married to. We lived in Columbus, Ohio, in a comfortable 2-story home on a quiet street lined with maple trees. It wasn't a mansion, but it was beautiful. We raised our children there. We celebrated birthdays, graduations, Christmas mornings, and countless Sunday dinners around the same dining room table where everything would eventually fall apart. When Richard and I first met, I was 27 and working as an administrative assistant for a small insurance company. He was already climbing the ladder at a regional bank. He made me feel special, seen, chosen. I remember the way he looked at me during our first date. I remember thinking I had finally found someone who genuinely cared about my thoughts and feelings. Back then, I couldn't imagine the woman I would become decades later. A woman who would question her own memory. A woman who would sit awake at 3 a.m. wondering whether she was losing her mind. A woman whose own children would someday doubt her. But none of that happened overnight. That's the thing about manipulation. It rarely starts with cruelty. It starts with tiny things. Small things. Things so insignificant that you barely notice them. During our first few years of marriage, Richard would occasionally correct me in front of people. If I told a story, he'd interrupt. "No, Sheila, that's not exactly how it happened." Then he'd retell it his way. Everyone would laugh. I laughed too. It seemed harmless. Then it became more frequent. If I remembered a conversation differently, Richard would insist I was mistaken. If I forgot a date or appointment, he'd make a point of mentioning it repeatedly. Good thing one of us remembers these things. People laughed. I laughed too. At least in the beginning. Over time, I started apologizing more. I started second-guessing myself. I began checking things twice before speaking, then 3 times, sometimes 4. I didn't realize it then, but my confidence was slowly disappearing. Piece by piece, year after year. Still, Richard never raised a hand to me. He never screamed. He never did anything dramatic enough for someone to say, "That's abuse." Instead, he mastered something much more subtle: control. By the time our daughter Jennifer was born, Richard handled all the finances. It wasn't something we discussed. It simply happened. He paid the bills, managed investments, handled taxes, made major financial decisions. At first, I appreciated it. Life was busy. Then Brandon came along 3 years later, and I eventually left my job to focus on raising our children. The arrangement made sense. At least that's what I told myself. Richard worked. I managed the home. Years passed. Then decades. The children grew up. Jennifer became a physical therapist. Brandon started his own construction business. Both built successful lives. Both adored their father. And honestly, why wouldn't they? Richard attended every soccer game, every graduation, every school event. He helped Jennifer buy her first car, helped Brandon secure a business loan. To the outside world, he was the perfect husband and father. Sometimes I wondered if I was the only person seeing another side of him, the side that emerged when nobody else was around, the side that made me feel small. I remember one particular evening about 10 years ago. We were preparing dinner together. I suggested taking a vacation to Maine. I had always wanted to see the coastline. Richard laughed. Not kindly, actually laughed. Then he said, "You worry about decorating the guest room. Leave the planning to people who understand money." I remember standing there holding a wooden spoon, frozen, embarrassed, ashamed. It wasn't even what he said. It was how naturally he said it, as if my opinion genuinely didn't matter. The next morning, he acted perfectly normal. No apology, no acknowledgement. Just another day. Over time, I learned something important. Richard didn't need to shout. His power came from making me feel unreasonable whenever I expressed hurt. If I confronted him, he would smile, then say things like, "You're too sensitive." I was joking. "You're imagining things." That's not what I meant. Eventually, arguing became exhausting. So I stopped. Or at least, I stopped most of the time. As retirement approached, I thought things might improve. After all, we'd survived more than 3 decades together. Maybe life would become simpler. Maybe we'd finally enjoy the peaceful years everyone talks about. Instead, retirement changed Richard. Or maybe it revealed who he had always been. Without work to occupy his attention, he became increasingly critical. Nothing I did seemed right. If I cooked, he'd complain. If I cleaned, he'd point out what I'd missed. If I shared an opinion, he'd dismiss it. The strange thing was that he never behaved this way in front of others. Only when we were alone. One afternoon, my friend Diane Foster visited for coffee. We've been friends for nearly 25 years. After Diane left, Richard looked at me and said, "You spend a lot of time talking to her." I shrugged. "She's my friend." He nodded. Then he said something that stayed with me. "Be careful who you complain to. People might start thinking things about you." At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. Now I do. It wasn't advice. It was a warning, a subtle one, but a warning all the same. As months passed, I noticed something else. Richard became increasingly concerned with appearances. He cared deeply about how others viewed him. More than ever before, he joined community boards, volunteered at local events, attended charity fundraisers. People praised him constantly, and every compliment seemed to feed something inside him. Meanwhile, I felt increasingly invisible, not because I wanted attention, but because my voice seemed to matter less and less, even inside my own home. The hardest part wasn't the criticism. It wasn't the control. It wasn't even the loneliness. The hardest part was convincing myself that maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I was being unfair. Maybe I expected too much. After all, everyone loved Richard. Everyone respected him. Everyone thought he was wonderful, including our children, especially our children. And that's what made what happened later so devastating. Because when the cracks finally started showing, nobody believed me. Not at first. Not Jennifer. Not Brandon. Not even me. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs were everywhere. The dismissive comments. The quiet manipulation. The constant need for control. The way he carefully managed how others saw him. But hindsight is cruel. It shows you truths that were invisible while you were living them. At 62 years old, I believed my marriage was simply going through a difficult season. I thought Richard and I had ordinary problems. I thought we could work through them. What I didn't know was that my husband was already keeping secrets, big ones. And before long, one small discovery would force me to question everything I thought I knew about the man sleeping beside me every night. The first real crack appeared on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember the day because it seemed completely ordinary. The sky was overcast. I had spent the morning grocery shopping and was unloading bags from my car when Richard's phone started ringing inside the house. Normally, he never left his phone unattended. Never. Not even for a trip to the mailbox. But that afternoon, he was mowing the lawn and had forgotten it on the kitchen counter. The screen lit up. I wasn't trying to snoop. At least not at first. But when I glanced down, I noticed something strange. There was no name, only a phone number. And beneath it was a text preview. Miss you already. My stomach dropped. The message disappeared before I could read more. For several seconds, I simply stood there staring at the dark screen. Then I heard the lawnmower outside. Richard was still working. I looked away, then looked back. I wish I could say I ignored it. I didn't. For the first time in 34 years of marriage, I picked up my husband's phone. The device was locked. Of course it was. Richard had changed his password several months earlier. At the time, he claimed it was for security reasons. Now I wasn't so sure. When he came inside, sweaty from yard work, I casually mentioned the text. His reaction surprised me. Not because he looked guilty, because he looked annoyed. "Why were you looking at my phone?" he asked immediately. No explanation, no denial, just a question. I felt myself shrinking. "It's not what you think," I said. It looked personal. He grabbed a bottle of water from the refrigerator, then shrugged. Probably spam. Spam. Someone who missed him already. I wanted to argue. Instead, I stayed quiet. That had become a habit over the years. A few days later, something else happened. Richard announced he was driving to Cincinnati for a meeting with former banking colleagues. Nothing unusual there. Many retired professionals kept in touch with old coworkers. He left early in the morning and returned after dark. The trip seemed normal. Until I started doing laundry. As I emptied the pockets of his sport coat, I found a receipt. A hotel receipt. Not from Cincinnati, from Cleveland. 3 hours in the opposite direction. I stared at the paper for nearly a minute. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe he stopped there. Maybe he met someone. Maybe no. I wasn't ready to finish that thought. That evening, I placed the receipt on the kitchen table. When Richard walked in, he immediately saw it. His eyes froze for half a second. Then his expression became calm. Too calm. "What's this?" I asked. He looked down. "Oh, just that. Oh, you said you were in Cincinnati." I was. "Then why is this from Cleveland?" Without hesitation, he answered. "I met an old colleague there afterward. I waited." He continued. "It was last minute." "You never mentioned it." His jaw tightened. "Do I need permission to meet friends now?" There it was. The familiar strategy. Turn the question back on me. Make me sound unreasonable. Make me feel guilty for asking. And somehow it worked. At least partially. Because by bedtime, I found myself questioning whether I had overreacted. Again. The next morning, I called my daughter Jennifer. Not to accuse Richard, just to talk. Jennifer and I had always been close. At least I thought we were. When I carefully mentioned the receipt, there was a long silence. Then she sighed. "Mom." That single word immediately made my chest tighten. "What?" "Dad's retired. He's allowed to have friends." "I know that." "Then why are you investigating hotel receipts?" Investigating. The word stung. I wasn't investigating. I was confused, concerned, maybe even scared, but not investigating. "Jennifer, doesn't that seem strange to you?" "No." Her answer came too quickly. Then she added something that hurt even more. "I think you're reading too much into things lately." Lately. The word stayed with me long after the call ended. Because it wasn't the first time I'd heard it. A week later, Brandon said something similar. We were having lunch together when I casually brought up Richard's increasing secrecy. Brandon listened politely. Then he leaned back in his chair. "Mom, can I be honest?" My stomach sank. Whenever someone says that, the truth usually hurts. "Sure." "I think retirement has been harder on you than you realize." I blinked. "What does that mean?" "You spend a lot of time alone now." I stared at him. "So because I'm retired, I'm imagining things." "No." But his expression suggested otherwise. "I just think maybe you're focusing on little details. Little details. A mysterious text. A hotel receipt. Secretive behavior. Apparently those were little details." When I got home that afternoon, I cried in my car, not because of Richard, because of the children I had raised, the children who once came running to me whenever they were hurt, the children who suddenly seemed more willing to trust their father than believe their own mother. That was the moment I truly began feeling alone. Over the next several weeks, Richard's behavior became even stranger. He started taking calls outside. Sometimes he walked into the backyard. Other times he sat in his car. Whenever I approached, conversations ended immediately. One evening, I walked into the den unexpectedly. He was smiling at his phone. Not a normal smile. A warm smile. An intimate smile. The kind I hadn't seen directed at me in years. The second he noticed me, the expression vanished. He locked the screen, then stood up. "What are you doing?" he asked. I almost laughed. I lived there, yet somehow I felt like an intruder in my own home. "Just looking for a book." He nodded, but his eyes never left me. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Around 2 a.m, I got out of bed and walked downstairs. I wasn't planning to search for anything. I just needed air. The house was quiet, dark, still. As I passed Richard's home office, I noticed a light beneath the door. My heart began beating faster. Richard was supposed to be asleep. I carefully approached. The door wasn't fully closed. Through the narrow opening, I saw him sitting at his desk, looking at documents, stacks of documents, financial paperwork, folders, files. He quickly slipped something into a drawer, then locked it. Actually locked it. I had never seen him lock that drawer before. The next morning, I asked about it. His response was immediate. Private financial records are financial records, my records. The distinction hit me like a slap. My records, not ours, not family records. His records. For the first time, genuine fear settled into my chest, because something was changing, something bigger than secret phone calls, something bigger than hotel receipts. I couldn't explain it yet, but I felt it. The same way you feel a storm approaching before the clouds arrive. A few days later, I was hanging up Richard's jacket when something slipped from an inside pocket. A folded piece of paper. I opened it and froze. It wasn't another hotel receipt. It was a printed beneficiary form, part of a retirement investment account. I didn't fully understand everything I was looking at, but one detail stood out immediately. The primary beneficiary listed on the document was no longer Sheila Cole. Someone else's name had been typed there. The paper shook in my hands. I read it again, then a third time. Surely I was mistaken. Surely there had to be an explanation. But deep inside, I knew something had changed, something serious. And for the first time, I began to wonder whether the man I'd spent 34 years married to had been planning something behind my back for far longer than I realized. I didn't sleep much after finding the beneficiary form. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that unfamiliar name sitting where mine should have been. For 34 years, Richard and I had built a life together. Every paycheck, every mortgage payment, every sacrifice, every decision. Or at least I thought they had been ours. Now I wasn't sure of anything anymore. The next morning, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I asked questions, real questions, not careful questions designed to avoid upsetting Richard, not questions softened with apologies, direct questions. When Richard came downstairs for breakfast, I placed the beneficiary form on the table between us. He stopped walking. For a split second, I saw something flash across his face. Not guilt. Not surprise. Annoyance. Then it vanished. Where did you find that? He asked. No explanation. No denial. Just another question. In your jacket. His jaw tightened. You shouldn't be going through my things. I stared at him. After everything I had discovered, that was his concern. I think we're past that. He pulled out a chair and sat down. Then he calmly folded the paper and slid it into his pocket. It's an old document. Then why wasn't I listed? It's outdated. Who is the woman? His eyes immediately narrowed. There it was, the reaction I had been looking for. Not confusion, recognition. He knew exactly who I meant. But instead of answering, he stood up. I'm not having this conversation. Then he walked away. Just like that. No explanation, no reassurance, no attempt to comfort me. For the first time in our marriage, I felt genuine fear. Not fear that Richard would hurt me physically. Fear that I had never truly known the man I married. Over the next few weeks, something strange began happening. Jennifer started calling more often. At first, I thought she was simply checking on me. Then the questions began. "Mom, did you forget your doctor's appointment last month?" "No." "You did. Dad told me." I frowned. "No, Jennifer. I rescheduled it." Silence. Then, "Oh." A few days later, another call. "Mom, have you been paying bills twice by accident?" "What?" "Dad mentioned you've seemed distracted lately." I gripped the phone tighter. "No, I haven't." Again. Silence. Again. Uncertainty. It felt less like a conversation and more like an investigation. The same thing started happening with Brandon. One afternoon he stopped by unexpectedly. We sat on the back patio drinking iced tea. Everything seemed normal until he casually asked, "Mom, how's your memory been lately?" The glass nearly slipped from my hand. "My memory?" "Yeah." He shrugged. "Dad says you've been forgetting things." I stared at my son. My chest felt tight. "Your father said that he's worried about you." Worried. That word made me furious. Richard wasn't worried. He was planting seeds, and suddenly I could see it. Every strange question, every concerned phone call, every awkward conversation. Someone had been talking. Someone had been shaping a story behind my back. And that someone was my husband. That evening, I confronted him. The moment he walked through the door, I was waiting. "Why are you telling the children I'm losing my memory?" Richard froze. Only briefly. Then he laughed. Actually laughed. "Nobody said you're losing your memory. Jennifer and Brandon both asked me about it. I've mentioned that you've seemed stressed. That's not the same thing." He shrugged. "You're overreacting." There it was again. The phrase that had become the soundtrack of my marriage. You're overreacting. You're imagining things. You're too sensitive. I was beginning to realize something. The problem wasn't that Richard didn't hear me. The problem was that he wanted me doubting myself. Because a person who doubts herself is easier to control. That realization frightened me. A lot. A few days later, Jennifer invited me to lunch. I hoped it would be different. I hoped she'd listen. Instead, it became one of the most painful conversations of my life. We were halfway through our meal when she reached across the table and gently touched my hand. The way people do when they're about to deliver bad news. "Mom," she said softly. My stomach dropped. "What?" She hesitated. Then she said it. "Dad's worried you might need to see someone." The restaurant suddenly felt too small, too loud, too hot. "See someone." "A specialist." I stared at her. "A specialist for what?" She looked away. My heart broke before she even answered. "Memory issues." I couldn't breathe. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Not because I was confused. Because I was devastated. My own daughter believed it. She genuinely believed I might be losing my mind. And worse. She thought Richard was trying to help me. I left lunch early. I cried the entire drive home. Not delicate tears. Not quiet tears. The kind that make your chest hurt. The kind that leave you gasping for breath. When I got home, I sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes, trying to understand how things had reached this point. Then something happened that changed everything. I walked inside through the garage entrance. Richard was in his home office. The door was partially open. He didn't know I was home. As I approached, I heard his voice. He was talking to Brandon. I couldn't hear Brandon's side of the conversation. Only Richard's. What I heard made my blood run cold. She doesn't understand financial decisions anymore. Silence. That's what I'm trying to explain. More silence. Then, no, I'm serious. I'm concerned she's not capable of handling important paperwork. I froze. Every muscle in my body locked. Important paperwork. Not capable. Concerned. The words felt rehearsed, carefully chosen. Then Richard lowered his voice. But I still caught enough. If something happened to me tomorrow, she'd make a mess of everything. I backed away before he could see me. My hands were shaking. For the next hour, I sat alone in my bedroom, thinking, connecting pieces. The mysterious documents, the changed beneficiary, the locked drawer, the conversations with the children, the growing narrative that I was confused. For the first time, a terrifying possibility entered my mind. What if this wasn't about concern? What if this was preparation? What if Richard wasn't simply undermining me? What if he was building a case that would allow him to control everything? The house? The accounts? The investments? Maybe even my future. That night, long after Richard fell asleep, I walked quietly downstairs. I wasn't looking for trouble. I was looking for answers. His office door was unlocked. The room was dark. Moonlight spilled through the window. I carefully opened the drawer I had seen him lock before. To my surprise, it wasn't locked now. Inside were several folders, legal documents, financial records, property paperwork, and near the bottom, I found something that made my heart stop. A folder with my name on it. Not ours, mine. Sheila Cole. I slowly opened it. Inside were notes, copies of records, medical information, financial statements, and handwritten comments. Comments about my memory, my behavior, my decision-making ability. Someone was documenting me, like a case file, like evidence. And at that moment, sitting alone in the darkness of my husband's office, I realized something terrifying. Richard wasn't merely telling people I was forgetful. He was building a story designed to make everyone believe I couldn't be trusted, including my own children. And I had no idea how far he was willing to go. I barely slept after finding the file with my name on it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those pages. Notes about my behavior. Comments about my memory. Observations written as if I were a patient being monitored instead of a wife of 34 years. The most disturbing part wasn't that the file existed. It was how organized it was. Dates, examples, typed summaries. Some entries stretched back more than a year. Richard hadn't started this recently. He had been preparing for something for a long time. The next morning, after Richard left the house, I did something I never thought I would do. I went back into his office. I felt guilty, nervous, ashamed. But another emotion was stronger than all of those: fear. If my husband was creating a case against me, I needed to know why. I closed the office door behind me and carefully opened the drawer again. The folder was still there. So were several others. I pulled them out one by one. Property records, retirement accounts, insurance documents, investment statements. Most of it looked ordinary. until I found a thick envelope tucked beneath a stack of papers. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were copies of legal forms, power of attorney forms, financial authority documents, property transfer paperwork. At first, I didn't fully understand what I was reading. Then I saw my signature. My breath caught. I flipped to another page. There it was again. My signature. Then another. And another. 5 separate documents, every single one bearing my name. I stared at them in disbelief. The signatures looked like mine. Almost. But something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it. The letters were slightly different. The slant wasn't quite right. The pressure seemed off. I sat down in Richard's chair, suddenly feeling lightheaded. Had I signed these? Was I forgetting? The thought terrified me. Maybe Richard was right. Maybe something was wrong with me. Maybe I had signed them and simply couldn't remember. But deep inside, another voice spoke. A quiet voice. The same voice that had been warning me for months. No, something isn't right. I gathered the documents and took photographs with my phone. Every page, every signature, every date. Then I carefully returned everything exactly as I had found it. The rest of the day passed in a fog. I couldn't focus, couldn't eat, couldn't think clearly. Late that afternoon, I called Diane Foster. If there was one person I still trusted completely, it was her. We've been friends since Jennifer was in elementary school. She had seen every version of me. The happy years, the difficult years, the years when I convinced myself everything was fine. When she answered, I immediately burst into tears. 20 minutes later, she was sitting at my kitchen table, looking through the photos on my phone. The deeper she scrolled, the more serious her expression became. Finally, she looked up. Sheila, what? These documents scare me. My stomach tightened. Why? She pointed at one page. Because if these are legitimate, they give someone enormous financial control. I felt cold. Do you think I signed them? Diane studied the signatures carefully. Then she surprised me. I don't know. My heart sank, but I do know something. What? You need copies of everything. That evening, after Diane left, I followed her advice. I created a hidden folder on my laptop, uploaded every photograph, backed them up to cloud storage, emailed copies to myself. For the first time, I started acting like someone preparing for a fight, not because I wanted one, because I felt one coming. 3 days later, something happened that made everything worse. Jennifer invited me over for dinner. I hoped things between us were improving. Instead, I walked into what felt like an intervention. Jennifer, Brandon, and Richard, all sitting together, waiting. The moment I entered the room, I knew something was wrong. The atmosphere felt rehearsed, prepared, like they had already been talking before I arrived. Richard wore his concerned expression, the one that always fooled everyone. Jennifer patted the chair beside her. Mom, sit down. My heart began pounding. I sat. Nobody spoke immediately. Then Brandon cleared his throat. Mom, we're worried about you. There it was again. Worried. I was beginning to hate that word. What exactly are you worried about? Jennifer exchanged a glance with Richard. That glance hurt more than I can describe, because it told me they were on the same side, and I wasn't. You've seemed stressed lately, Jennifer said. You've been accusing Dad of things. Accusing? Another carefully chosen word. I looked directly at Richard. He lowered his eyes like a patient, suffering husband. The performance was almost impressive. If by accusing you mean asking questions, then yes. Richard sighed heavily. I knew this would happen. My blood pressure instantly rose. Knew what would happen. He folded his hands together. You're becoming paranoid. The room fell silent. I looked at my children, waiting for one of them to object. Neither did. Neither. Not my daughter. Not my son. Nobody defended me. For a moment, I genuinely wondered if I was losing my mind. Not because Richard convinced me. Because everyone else seemed convinced. That is what gaslighting does. Not when one person lies. When enough people start believing the lie. Jennifer reached for my hand. Mom, maybe you should talk to someone. There it was. The same suggestion again. A doctor, a specialist, an evaluation. I pulled my hand away. Slowly, carefully. I am not losing my memory. Nobody answered. And somehow, that silence hurt even more. The conversation ended shortly afterward. I drove home feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. But fate wasn't finished revealing things. The breakthrough came 4 days later, by complete accident. I was cleaning the guest room when I found an old storage box. Inside were tax returns, mortgage documents, old insurance records, and something else, a notarized property form from 15 years earlier. I almost threw it away. Then I noticed my signature. I stared at it. Then suddenly remembered the photos on my phone. My pulse quickened. I pulled out my phone, opened the images, placed them side by side. The difference was immediate, obvious, undeniable. The signatures were not the same, not even close. The loops, the spacing, the way I crossed my letters. Everything was different. I wasn't imagining it. I hadn't forgotten. Someone had copied my name. And whoever did it wasn't very good. For nearly a minute, I simply sat there staring. Then a terrifying realization struck me. If those signatures weren't mine, what else wasn't real? How many documents existed? How much money was involved? How long had this been happening? I suddenly understood something that made my blood run cold. This wasn't just about Richard trying to make me look unstable. This wasn't just about our children doubting me. There was a financial reason, a very large financial reason, and somewhere inside those locked files was the answer. That night, as Richard sat across from me watching television as though nothing were wrong, I looked at him differently. Not as my husband, not as the father of my children, not as the man I married. I looked at him as a stranger who had been quietly building something behind my back. And for the first time, I realized that whatever secret he was hiding was much bigger than an affair, much bigger than another woman. It involved money, property, control. And I was beginning to suspect that I was standing directly in the way of whatever future Richard Cole had planned for himself. For several days after discovering the forged signatures, I couldn't look at Richard the same way. Every conversation felt artificial. Every smile looked rehearsed. Every act of concern felt calculated. The worst part wasn't knowing something was wrong. It was not knowing how much was wrong. Was Richard stealing from me? Was he preparing to leave me? Was there really another woman? Or was I still missing the biggest piece of the puzzle? I needed answers. Real answers. Not assumptions. Not suspicions. Evidence. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. One Thursday morning, Richard announced he was meeting former colleagues for lunch. Normally, I wouldn't have paid attention. But lately, every outing seemed connected to a lie. He left around 11. I waited 10 minutes. Then I grabbed my keys. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I wasn't proud of what I was doing. I had never followed anyone before, not once in my life. But this wasn't the life I thought I had anymore. So I followed him, keeping several cars between us, trying not to be noticed. At first, everything appeared normal. He drove toward downtown Columbus. Then he took an unexpected turn. Instead of heading toward the restaurant district where he claimed his lunch meeting would be, he drove into a shopping area on the other side of town. My stomach tightened. Richard parked near a small cafe. I parked farther away. Then I watched. For nearly 10 minutes. Nothing happened. I started wondering if I had made a mistake. Then she arrived. A silver SUV pulled into the parking lot. A woman stepped out. She looked to be around my age, maybe a year younger, attractive. Well-dressed, confident. Her dark blonde hair was neatly styled. She carried herself like someone accustomed to getting attention. The moment Richard saw her, his face changed. I had seen that smile before, years ago, when he used to look at me that way. The realization hurt more than I expected. The woman smiled back. Then they embraced. Not like old co-workers, not like casual friends, like people who knew each other well, very well. I sat frozen in my car, unable to look away. The two of them entered the cafe together. For nearly an hour, I waited, watching through the window whenever I could, talking, laughing, leaning toward each other. At one point, Richard reached across the table and touched her hand. A simple gesture, but intimate, far too intimate. When they finally left, I quickly lowered my head. They walked toward their vehicles. Before separating, Richard handed her an envelope, a thick envelope. She slipped it into her purse, then kissed him on the cheek. Not the kind of kiss acquaintances exchange, something more familiar, more practiced, more personal. I felt physically sick. As they drove away, I sat alone in the parking lot, trying to process what I had just seen. For months I had suspected another woman. Now I had proof, or at least part of it. But strangely, the affair itself no longer felt like the biggest issue. The envelope bothered me more. Why was Richard giving her money? And why did it seem so routine that evening? I decided to search, not through his office, through his past. I remembered hearing Richard mention an old co-worker named Patricia years earlier. The name had surfaced occasionally during his banking career. Nothing memorable, at least at the time. Now it suddenly mattered. Using social media and public records, I started looking. Within 30 minutes, I found her. Patricia Bennett, 61 years old, former assistant branch manager. Divorced, living in a neighboring suburb. The moment I saw her photograph, I recognized her. The woman from the cafe. My chest tightened. So this was Patricia, not some random stranger, not someone new, someone who had been connected to Richard for years, maybe decades. I continued searching. The more I found, the more uncomfortable I became. Their professional paths had crossed repeatedly. Community events, banking conferences, charity functions, photographs, articles, Award ceremonies. Enough shared history to make me wonder how long this relationship truly existed. Days, months, years. I couldn't stop thinking about it. And once you start noticing something, you begin seeing clues everywhere. Richard became even more protective of his phone, more secretive about his schedule, more irritated whenever I asked questions. One evening, he received a text message while we were watching television. For a brief moment, the screen lit up. I only caught 3 words, thinking about today. The message disappeared before I could see the sender. But I didn't need to. I already knew. The following week brought another discovery. One even harder to ignore. Richard left the house early one morning. About an hour later, I received a call from Diane. She wanted to meet for coffee. While driving to meet her, I happened to pass a small park near the river. And there they were, Richard and Patricia, walking together, laughing, holding cups of coffee, looking completely comfortable, completely familiar, like a couple. I parked nearby, far enough away to avoid being seen, and watched. Part of me wanted to confront them immediately. Part of me wanted to scream, to demand answers. But another part of me understood something important. Confrontation would only make Richard more careful, more secretive. I needed information, not drama, so I stayed quiet. When I finally met Diane, she immediately knew something was wrong. What happened? I told her everything. The cafe, the envelope, the park, Patricia, the entire story. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she sat silently for a moment. Then she asked a question I hadn't considered. "Do you think Patricia knows about the documents?" I blinked. What documents? The forged signatures. The room suddenly felt colder. Because until that moment, I had treated the affair and the financial issues as separate problems. Now I wasn't so sure. What if they were connected? What if Patricia wasn't merely a romantic partner? What if she was part of the plan? The thought terrified me. Because affairs are painful, but financial betrayal can destroy lives. Over the next 2 weeks, I started documenting everything. Dates, locations, photographs, observations, every meeting I witnessed, every suspicious event. I kept detailed notes, not because I wanted revenge, because I was beginning to feel unsafe, not physically, legally, financially, emotionally. And the more evidence I collected, the clearer one thing became. Richard wasn't acting impulsively. Everything seemed organized, planned, deliberate. Then something happened that changed the entire direction of my investigation. One afternoon, I followed Richard again. This time he met Patricia in a parking garage downtown. I watched from a distance. The meeting lasted less than 5 minutes. No hugging, no coffee, no conversation, just business. Patricia handed Richard a folder. Richard opened it briefly, nodded, then placed it inside his briefcase. They immediately left in opposite directions. The entire exchange looked professional, almost like a transaction. And suddenly I knew. This wasn't just a love affair. Something else connected them. Something involving paperwork, documents, money. Perhaps even the papers hidden inside Richard's office. That night, as Richard sat across from me eating dinner, I realized I was no longer looking for evidence of infidelity. I was looking for evidence of a conspiracy. And somewhere in the middle of all of it was the truth. A truth that felt increasingly dangerous. A truth that was slowly destroying my family. a truth that would soon force Richard to reveal more than he ever intended. The more I learned about Richard and Patricia, the more dangerous my situation began to feel. Not because they knew I was investigating. At least, I didn't think they did. The danger came from something else. I was beginning to understand how carefully Richard had built his image over the years. Everyone trusted him. Everyone. Neighbors, friends, former co-workers, even our children, especially our children. And that meant if Richard decided to tell a lie, most people would believe it before they believed me. That realization kept me awake at night. The file in his office, the forged signatures, the secret meetings, the mysterious paperwork. Everything pointed toward a plan, but I still didn't know the final goal. Then Richard started making mistakes. Not obvious mistakes, small ones. The kind made by people who become too confident. One Saturday afternoon, Jennifer and Brandon came over for a family barbecue. It should have been a pleasant day. Instead, it became another lesson in how thoroughly Richard had turned our family against me. We were sitting on the back patio when Jennifer mentioned a television show she'd been watching. The conversation was casual, lighthearted. Then somehow the topic shifted to memory. Before I could even react, Richard sighed dramatically. The performance was so smooth it almost impressed me. I just hope we catch things early if there are problems. Jennifer looked concerned. What do you mean? Richard glanced toward me, then away, as though he didn't want to say more, as though he was protecting me. It was brilliant, manipulative, cruel, and brilliant. Oh, it's nothing. Jennifer immediately leaned forward. Dad. He hesitated, then sighed again. The last thing I'd ever want is to embarrass your mother. I felt my blood pressure rising. Brandon looked confused. What are you talking about? Richard shook his head. Forget it. That, of course, guaranteed nobody would forget it. Jennifer touched his arm. Dad, finally, he spoke. Your mom has been forgetting things. The words hit me like a slap. I stared at him. He didn't even look guilty. Not for a second. He looked concerned, compassionate, heartbroken, like a devoted husband struggling with a painful reality. It was an Academy Award-worthy performance. Jennifer immediately turned toward me. Mom, I couldn't believe what was happening. I am sitting right here. Richard quickly raised his hands. Nobody is attacking you. I nearly laughed. Attack me. Then tell me nobody is attacking me. The irony was unbelievable. But Richard wasn't finished. Over the next 20 minutes, he carefully presented example after example. A missed appointment, a misplaced receipt, a forgotten conversation. Each example sounded convincing, reasonable, normal, except there was one problem. Most of them weren't true. The appointment had been rescheduled. The receipt had never existed. The conversation happened exactly as I remembered it. But facts didn't matter, because Richard wasn't presenting evidence. He was creating an impression, and impressions are powerful. By the end of lunch, Jennifer looked worried, Brandon looked uncertain, and I looked defensive, which was exactly what Richard wanted. The moment I argued, I appeared emotional. The moment I got angry, I appeared unstable. The trap was perfect. Later that evening, after the children left, I confronted him. Again. Maybe part of me still hoped there was some explanation, some misunderstanding. Some version of reality where my husband wasn't deliberately destroying my credibility. I found him in the den, watching television, completely relaxed. "Why are you doing this?" He didn't even look away from the screen. Doing what? I hated that response, because it was always the same. Always. The innocent act, the confusion, the denial. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Now he looked at me. Calm, cold, controlled. "I think you're upset." There it was. Not an answer. A diagnosis. I folded my arms. "Stop telling people I'm losing my mind." Something changed in his eyes. Only for a moment. A tiny flicker. Then it disappeared. "I've never said that." The lie was so effortless it almost frightened me. Not because he lied, because he believed he could, and because most people would believe him. I left the room before the argument could continue. For the first time, I realized something important. I wasn't dealing with an unfaithful husband. I was dealing with someone actively building a narrative, and every conversation was part of it. A few days later, Diane called. I told her everything. The barbecue, the accusations, the manipulation. When I finished, she was silent. Then she asked a question. "Have you ever considered recording him?" I froze. The idea felt extreme, almost absurd. Recording my own husband, it sounded like something from a crime show. Not real life, not my life. But Diane continued, "Sheila, nobody believes you because everything is your word against his." I hated how true that sounded. "Then get proof. Proof." The word lingered in my mind long after the call ended. That evening I drove to an electronics store across town. I told myself I was only looking. Nothing more. But 20 minutes later, I walked out carrying a small digital voice recorder. It fit in the palm of my hand. Simple. Inexpensive. Easy to hide. The entire drive home, I questioned myself. Was I becoming paranoid? Was I crossing a line? Was I turning into someone I didn't recognize? Then I remembered Jennifer's worried expression, Brandon's doubts, the file in Richard's office, the forged signatures, Patricia. The answer became clear. No, I wasn't paranoid. I was finally paying attention. The recorder stayed hidden in my purse for several days. I never used it. I kept waiting for the right moment, the right conversation, the right opportunity. Meanwhile, Richard became even more aggressive, subtly aggressive, the kind that leaves no bruises. One morning, he walked into the kitchen and asked where his reading glasses were. I haven't seen them. He searched for a few minutes, then found them on his nightstand. Instead of laughing it off, he smiled sadly. "You see?" I stared at him. "See what?" "You forgot." My jaw dropped. "They were on your nightstand." He shrugged. "As long as that's what you remember." Then he walked away. I stood frozen in the kitchen. Because that sentence wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. A reminder, a warning, a message. He wanted me questioning myself every day, every conversation, every memory. And the frightening part was that it was starting to work. There were moments when I genuinely wondered whether I could trust my own mind. Moments when I doubted things I knew were true. Moments when I understood why people trapped in manipulative relationships feel powerless. The manipulation doesn't happen all at once. It happens one tiny cut at a time, until eventually you're bleeding confidence from 1,000 invisible wounds. Then came the moment that changed everything. A rainy Thursday evening. The house was quiet. Richard and I were alone. He had been drinking bourbon. Not enough to be drunk, but enough to lower his guard. We started arguing. At first, it was about Patricia, then the documents, then the lies. The conversation escalated quickly, faster than usual, and for the first time in months, Richard stopped pretending. The mask began to crack. I felt my heart pounding, because hidden inside my purse, resting silently beneath the table beside me, the recorder was running, and Richard had no idea. The rain had been falling for hours, steady, relentless. The kind of rain that turns windows into mirrors and makes a house feel smaller than it really is. Richard sat in his leather chair with a glass of bourbon in one hand. The television was on, but neither of us was watching it. The tension between us had become impossible to ignore. For months, I'd been swallowing my questions, swallowing my anger, swallowing my fear. That night, I couldn't do it anymore, and for the first time, neither could Richard. What he didn't know was that the small recorder hidden inside my purse was already running. Every word, every breath, every lie, capturing everything. I didn't know it yet, but the next hour would change the course of my life and destroy his. It started with Patricia. Again, I saw you with her. Richard didn't look surprised, not even slightly. He took another sip of bourbon, then shrugged. So, the answer stunned me. Not because of what he said, because of how casually he said it. No denial, no explanation, no excuse. Just so. I stared at him. You aren't even going to pretend anymore. For a moment he said nothing. Then he laughed. Actually laughed. The sound sent chills down my spine. You finally figured it out. I felt my stomach tighten. The confidence in his voice was terrifying. Not because he was innocent, because he believed he had already won. How long? I asked. He smirked. Does it matter? How long, Richard? He leaned back, thinking, calculating. Then he answered, long enough. I felt tears gathering in my eyes. Not because of Patricia. Not anymore. The affair was almost irrelevant now. The betrayal went much deeper than that. What about our marriage? His smile disappeared. Then came something worse. Contempt. Pure contempt. You really want the truth? I nodded. And for the first time in years, Richard stopped pretending to be the good husband. The mask fell. I stayed because it was convenient. The words hit me like a punch. I couldn't breathe. 34 years. 34 years together. And that was what it meant to him. Convenient. He continued. You handled the house. You raised the kids. You made life easier. I sat frozen, listening, trying to understand how the man in front of me could sound so unfamiliar, so cold. Then he said something that hurt even more. You were useful. Useful. Not loved. Not valued. Useful. I thought about every sacrifice and every holiday and every birthday. Every dream I put aside for our family, reduced to one word. Useful. Richard watched my reaction carefully, almost enjoying it. Then he made a mistake. A very big mistake. He underestimated how much anger he had bottled up over the years. And once he started talking, he couldn't stop. What about the documents? I asked. For the first time, something flashed across his face. Not fear. Annoyance. I knew you'd find them eventually. My heart began pounding. You forged my signature." He laughed again. "Can you prove that?" I felt cold. Very cold. The recorder sat quietly in my purse, recording everything. "Did you?" He tilted his head, then shrugged. "You signed plenty of paperwork over the years." That wasn't an answer. But it wasn't a denial either. I pressed harder. "Why were you changing beneficiaries?" Richard looked directly into my eyes. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Because I was preparing for the future." The future. Mine. The word hung in the air. Mine, not ours. Never ours. Mine. Suddenly everything made sense. The secret documents. The hidden accounts. The meetings with Patricia. The attempts to discredit me. The file in his office. Everything connected. Every piece. I looked at him. "You were planning to leave me." He laughed. "No." The answer surprised me. Then he leaned forward and revealed something far worse. "I was planning to make sure nobody believed you." The room went silent. Even the rain seemed quieter. For several seconds, I simply stared at him, certain I had heard wrong. "What?" He smiled, slowly, coldly. The smile of a man who believed he had complete control. "You heard me." I felt my pulse racing. "Why?" His answer came immediately. "Because it was easier." I couldn't understand. Easier than what? Easier than fighting. Easier than divorce. Easier than explaining. Easier than splitting assets. Easier than letting me defend myself. The realization made me physically ill. He wasn't simply trying to leave. He was trying to destroy my credibility first. Then nobody would question what happened afterward. Nobody would believe me. Nobody would challenge him. It was horrifying. And yet Richard kept talking, almost proudly, as though he were explaining a clever business strategy. "The children already doubt you." I felt tears in my eyes. "You used them." He shrugged. "They made it easy." That sentence broke something inside me, not because he insulted me, because he insulted our children, Jennifer, Brandon. The two people I loved most in the world. He had manipulated them, used their trust, turned them into weapons against their own mother. And he didn't even care. Then came another confession. One even worse. "I've spent more than a year preparing." A year. Not weeks. Not months. A year. Maybe longer. Every conversation suddenly felt different. Every concern. Every worried phone call. Every suggestion that I see a specialist. Every comment about my memory. All of it planned. All of it intentional. I realized I was no longer listening to my husband. I was listening to a confession. And he still didn't know it. Richard finished his drink, then stood up, walking toward the kitchen. I followed him, my heart pounding harder with every step. "What about Patricia?" He stopped, then laughed. A tired laugh. The laugh of someone who thinks consequences don't exist. "What about her?" "Were you planning to marry her?" He didn't answer immediately. That silence was answer enough. Then he said, "Patricia understands me." The words felt like acid. After everything. After 34 years. That was his explanation. But Richard wasn't finished. The bourbon had loosened his tongue, and his ego was doing the rest. "You know what your problem is, Sheila?" I folded my arms. "No. Tell me." His eyes narrowed. "You still think people see you the way you see yourself." I stared at him. "What does that mean?" "It means people trust me." The confidence in his voice was chilling. "They always have. He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the bourbon. Then he delivered the sentence that would eventually destroy him. The sentence that would change everything. The sentence captured perfectly on my recorder. No one would believe you anyway. My heart stopped, not because I was surprised, because he genuinely believed it. Completely, absolutely, no doubt, no hesitation. No one would believe you. The words echoed through my mind. Then he smiled, a victorious smile, the smile of a man who thought he had already won. What Richard didn't realize was that his entire future now existed inside a tiny digital recorder sitting quietly inside my purse. And before long, everyone he had manipulated would hear exactly who he really was. I barely slept after recording Richard's confession. Every time I replayed the audio, my hands shook. Not because I doubted what I had heard, because I finally had proof. For months, I had been questioning myself, wondering if I was imagining things, wondering if grief, stress, or age had somehow distorted my judgment. Now I knew the truth. I wasn't losing my mind. Richard had been trying to make everyone think I was, and sitting inside my purse was the evidence. The next morning, I drove to Diane's house. I didn't trust myself to listen to the recording alone. I needed someone else to hear it. Someone objective. Someone who loved me enough to be honest. Diane opened the door and immediately knew something had happened. Her eyes widened. Sheila. I walked inside. I got it. For a moment she looked confused. Then realization crossed her face. The recording? I nodded. 20 minutes later, we sat at her kitchen table, my phone between us, the room silent. I pressed play. The recording began. At first, Diane listened quietly. Then Richard's voice filled the room. Clear, undeniable, cold, cruel. Every confession, every insult, every admission, every lie, the entire conversation. When it ended, neither of us spoke. Not immediately. Diane looked pale. Her eyes were wet. Finally, she whispered, "Oh my God." I stared at the table, unable to speak, unable to think. For months I had felt invisible. Now someone else finally saw it. Someone else finally heard it. Diane reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Sheila," I looked up. "You're not crazy." Those 3 words broke me. I started crying. Not delicate tears, not quiet tears. Years of pain poured out at once. Years of self-doubt. Years of humiliation. Years of believing maybe the problem was me. Diane moved her chair beside mine, held my hand, and let me cry. When I finally calmed down, she asked the question that mattered most. "What are you going to do now?" I stared at the recorder, at the phone, at the proof. The answer should have been obvious, but it wasn't, because proof changes everything and nothing. At the same time, I could expose Richard, but doing so would destroy my family. Jennifer, Brandon, the grandchildren, everything. Part of me still wanted to protect them. Even after all of this, especially after all of this. Diane listened carefully, then said something I needed to hear. "Richard didn't protect your family." I closed my eyes, because she was right. Every terrible thing happening had started with him, not me. For the first time, I stopped feeling guilty. A few days later, Richard made his move. The call came from Jennifer. She sounded nervous, uncomfortable, as though she had rehearsed the conversation beforehand. "Mom? Hi, sweetheart?" There was a pause. Then, "Dad wants everyone to come over Sunday." Immediately, I felt something tighten in my chest. "What for?" Another pause. "Family discussion." I already knew. Before she even answered, I knew. This was it. The next step. The next phase of Richard's plan. He had spent more than a year laying the foundation. Now he was ready to build on it. When 6 o'clock, I thanked her, hung up, and sat staring at the wall. The family discussion. The phrase sounded harmless, but I knew better. Richard wasn't gathering everyone because he cared about family. He was gathering witnesses. Witnesses to whatever came next. That evening, I called Diane, then attorney Susan Mitchell, the lawyer Diane had recommended weeks earlier. I didn't tell Susan everything. Not yet. But I described the documents, the forged signatures, the financial concerns, and most importantly, the recording. There was a long silence on the phone. Then Susan said, "Keep multiple copies." My stomach tightened. "Why?" "Because if what you're telling me is accurate, that recording could become extremely important." I glanced at the device sitting on my kitchen counter. Small, ordinary, yet powerful enough to destroy a lifetime of deception. By Friday evening, I had created copies everywhere. Cloud storage, USB drives, email attachments. One copy with Diane, another stored in a safe deposit box, and one already forwarded to Attorney Mitchell. Just in case. I wasn't taking chances anymore. Saturday passed slowly, painfully slowly. Richard acted completely normal, which somehow made everything worse. He watched television, read the newspaper, asked what I wanted for dinner. The performance never stopped. Not for a moment. Not even after his confession. It was as though two different people lived inside him. The charming man everyone knew, and the ruthless man hidden underneath. Sunday finally arrived. The day of the dinner. The day everything would change. I spent nearly an hour deciding what to wear, not because I cared about appearances, because I wanted to feel strong, in control, prepared. I chose a navy blue blouse and simple pearl earrings, the same earrings my mother gave me years ago, the last gift she ever bought me. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. I looked tired, older, but I also saw something new. Resolve. For the first time in months, I wasn't afraid. Nervous, absolutely. Terrified, maybe. But not helpless. Not anymore. At 6 o'clock sharp, Jennifer arrived with her husband, then Brandon, then Richard. Everyone gathered around the dining room table, the same table where birthdays had been celebrated, the same table where holidays had been shared, the same table where my marriage would effectively end. The atmosphere felt strange from the beginning. Too formal, too organized, almost scripted. Richard sat at the head of the table. Naturally. Jennifer sat beside him. Brandon across from her. I sat alone at the opposite end. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. For months, Richard had positioned himself as the protector, the concerned husband, the worried father, and I had become the problem, the unstable one, the woman everyone needed to worry about. Dinner passed awkwardly. Small talk, weather, work, grandchildren. Nobody mentioned the real reason we were there. Until Richard finally cleared his throat. The room immediately became quiet. He folded his hands together, then looked around the table, perfectly composed. perfectly calm. The performance had begun. I wanted us together tonight because I think we need to discuss Sheila. There it was. My name. Not our marriage. Not our family. Me. Jennifer lowered her eyes. Brandon looked uncomfortable, but neither interrupted. Richard continued. I've been concerned for some time. The same concerned voice. The same compassionate expression. The same lie. He talked about forgetfulness, confusion, stress, decision-making. Every word carefully chosen. Every sentence designed to sound reasonable. By the time he finished, Jennifer was visibly emotional. Brandon looked conflicted, and Richard looked victorious. Then he reached into a folder beside his chair and removed several documents. My pulse quickened. I recognized them immediately. Paperwork. Financial paperwork. Exactly as I had feared. Richard placed them on the table, then looked directly at me. The confidence in his eyes was unmistakable. He thought he had already won. And then he said the exact words from the recording. The exact words. No one is going to believe you anyway. Silence filled the room. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Richard smiled. The smile of a man who believed he had complete control. Slowly, I reached into my purse and wrapped my fingers around my phone. The room remained silent. Richard watched me. Confident, relaxed, certain. He had no idea that in the next few moments every lie he had spent years building was about to collapse in front of everyone he loved. My fingers tightened around my phone. For a moment, nobody at the table noticed. Richard certainly didn't. Why would he? He believed the conversation was over. He believed the decision had already been made. He believed he had successfully convinced our children that I was unstable, that I was confused, that I couldn't be trusted. And for months, he had been right. But not tonight. Tonight was different. I looked around the table, at Jennifer, at Brandon, at the family I had spent my entire adult life protecting. Neither of them looked happy. Neither looked confident. They looked worried, conflicted, lost. And suddenly, I realized something important. Richard hadn't only manipulated me, he had manipulated them too. They were victims of his lies just as much as I was. That realization gave me strength. I slowly unlocked my phone. Richard barely glanced at me. His attention was focused on the documents spread across the table. Papers he believed would secure his victory. Papers he expected me to sign. Papers that represented months, perhaps years of planning. Then I spoke. My voice was calm, much calmer than I felt. Before we continue, I'd like everyone to hear something. Richard frowned. What? I met his eyes. Just listen. For the first time that evening, uncertainty flickered across his face, only briefly. Then he recovered. Sheila, this isn't necessary. The confidence in his voice had weakened. Just slightly. But I heard it, and so did he. I pressed play. At first, the room was silent. The recording began with the sound of rain hitting the windows. Then came our voices. Mine. And Richard's. Jennifer frowned. Brandon looked confused. Nobody understood what they were hearing yet. Then Richard's recorded voice filled the room. Clear. Sharp. Undeniable. You finally figured it out. The entire table froze. Richard immediately sat upright. His face drained of color. Not completely. Just enough. Enough for me to notice. Enough to know he understood exactly what was happening. The recording continued. Every word, every confession, every lie, every cruel truth. The room became so quiet that I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Nobody breathed. Richard's recorded voice echoed through the dining room. I stayed because it was convenient. Jennifer's eyes widened. Brandon slowly turned toward his father. Richard remained frozen. For the first time in years, he had no control over the conversation, no ability to redirect, no opportunity to manipulate. The recording didn't care about his charm. The recording didn't care about his reputation. The recording simply told the truth, and the truth was devastating. I was planning to make sure nobody believed you. Jennifer covered her mouth. Oh my God. The words barely escaped her lips. I felt tears stinging my eyes. Not because I was surprised, because I finally wasn't alone. Someone else heard it. Someone else knew. The recording continued. The children already doubt you. Brandon's face changed. The hurt appeared immediately. Raw, visible, painful. Because suddenly he understood. Every conversation, every concern, every question he'd asked me. Richard had orchestrated all of it, not out of love, not out of concern, out of strategy. I watched my son slowly lower his eyes, as if ashamed, as if he couldn't bear to look at me. And then came the moment that shattered everything, the sentence that changed the entire room. They made it easy. The recording stopped, not because I paused it, because it had reached the end. Silence followed, the kind of silence that feels alive, heavy, uncomfortable, impossible to escape. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. For several seconds, all we could hear was the ticking clock on the wall. Then Jennifer started crying, softly at first, then harder. She stared at her father, the man she had trusted her entire life, the man she believed was protecting the family, the man who had used her. Richard finally found his voice. That's not what it sounds like. The response was automatic, desperate, predictable. Jennifer looked at him. What? It was taken out of context. I almost laughed. Out of context. The favorite excuse of guilty people everywhere. Brandon leaned forward. His expression had completely changed. The uncertainty was gone. The confusion was gone. In their place was anger. Real anger. What context? Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. Because there wasn't one. No explanation existed. No alternative interpretation. No misunderstanding. Everyone had heard exactly what he said. Jennifer wiped tears from her face. Dad, the word broke halfway through. Not because she was emotional, because she was devastated. The man she admired most had just become a stranger. Richard tried again. You don't understand. No, Brandon said sharply. His voice startled everyone, including me. We understand perfectly. The room fell silent again. Richard looked at his son. Then at Jennifer, then at me. For the first time, I saw fear. Real fear, not concern, not annoyance, fear. Because he realized something. The spell was breaking. Years of manipulation. Years of careful lies. Years of control. And it was all collapsing. Right there at the dining room table. Richard reached for the papers in front of him. Perhaps instinctively. Perhaps hoping to regain control. But Brandon noticed. What are those? Richard hesitated. Financial documents. I almost smiled. Financial documents. Such a harmless phrase. Such an innocent description. Brandon extended his hand. Let me see them. Richard didn't move. That hesitation said everything. Brandon repeated himself. Let me see them. Slowly, reluctantly. Richard handed them over. Brandon began reading. One page, then another, then another. His expression darkened with each document. What is this? Richard said nothing. Jennifer moved beside her brother, looking over his shoulder. Then her face turned pale. What are these signatures? My heart began pounding, because we had finally reached the next part. The documents, the signatures, the hidden plan. Brandon compared several pages, then looked directly at me. Mom, his voice cracked. Did you sign these? I shook my head. No. For the first time in months, nobody questioned my answer. Nobody doubted me. Nobody suggested I might be confused, because now they knew. Finally, they knew. Richard stood abruptly. The movement startled everyone. This is ridiculous. The old confidence was gone. The polished image was cracking. Fast. You recorded a private conversation. There it was. Not denial. Not innocence. An attack. When guilty people lose control of the facts, they attack the method. Jennifer stared at him. Dad, that's what you're worried about. He didn't answer, because there was no answer, and everyone knew it. For years, Richard had controlled every room he entered, every conversation, every narrative. But now the room belonged to the truth, and the truth was stronger than he ever expected. I looked at my husband, the man I had loved for 34 years, the man who had spent months convincing everyone that I was the problem, the man who had told me nobody would believe me. Then I quietly asked the question that changed everything. Would you like me to play the rest? The color disappeared from Richard's face completely, and in that moment, everyone at the table understood one thing. The recording they had just heard was only the beginning. Nobody spoke. Not for several seconds. The silence after my question felt heavier than everything that had come before it. Would you like me to play the rest? Richard stared at me. His face had gone completely pale. For years, I had watched him control every room he entered, every conversation, every disagreement, every family gathering. He always knew exactly what to say, exactly how to steer people, exactly how to position himself as the reasonable one, the trustworthy one, the victim. Now, for the first time, he looked lost, truly lost. Jennifer sat frozen beside him. Tears still streaked her cheeks. Brandon was staring at the documents spread across the table, reading them again and again, as if hoping they would somehow transform into something innocent, something explainable. But they didn't, because they weren't. Richard finally cleared his throat. His voice sounded different now, less confident, less polished. There's no need for more recordings. The statement almost made me smile. No need. Interesting. A few minutes earlier, he would have called me confused, paranoid, emotional. Now he simply wanted the recording to stop. I looked directly at him. Why, he didn't answer. Because he couldn't. Jennifer slowly turned toward him. Dad, her voice trembled. What else is on the recording? Richard looked away. That alone was an answer. The old Richard would have immediately denied everything, immediately explained, immediately taken control. This Richard couldn't even make eye contact. Jennifer noticed too. I could see it, the realization spreading across her face, the growing understanding that the father she trusted had lied to her, not once, not twice, repeatedly. Systematically, for a very long time. Brandon suddenly picked up one of the documents. His eyes narrowed. Wait. Nobody moved. He held the paper closer, then reached for another, then another. I recognized them immediately. The financial forms, the beneficiary changes, the authorization documents, the same documents I had photographed weeks earlier. What is it? Jennifer asked. Brandon didn't answer immediately. He was studying the signatures, comparing them. His construction business required contracts, permits, loan paperwork. He reviewed documents every day. Details mattered to him. And suddenly, those details were catching his attention. He looked up. Dad? Richard remained silent. Brandon pointed to a signature. Why doesn't Mom's signature match? The room froze. Again. Richard immediately responded, It does. No. Brandon shook his head. It doesn't. He placed several pages side by side. The differences became obvious. The slant, the spacing, the shape of the letters. I had seen it weeks earlier. Now my son was seeing it too. Jennifer leaned forward. Her eyes widened. Oh my God. Richard's jaw tightened. It's not unusual for signatures to vary. Normally that might have sounded reasonable, but nothing sounded reasonable anymore. Not after the recording. Not after the lies. Not after everything. Brandon stood up. The movement startled everyone. Then he looked directly at his father. When did Mom sign these? Richard hesitated. Only briefly, but it was enough. I don't remember. Wrong answer. Everyone knew it, because for years Richard remembered everything. Every date, every account, every investment, every tiny financial detail. Now suddenly he couldn't remember. Nobody believed him. Not anymore. Jennifer slowly shook her head. I can't believe this. The pain in her voice nearly broke my heart, because she wasn't just losing trust in her father. She was losing the image of him she had carried her entire life. The man she thought he was, the man she wanted him to be, the man who never actually existed. Then Brandon said something that surprised me, something I never expected. I'm sorry, Mom. The words hit me harder than I anticipated. I looked at him, really looked at him. He looked devastated, ashamed, heartbroken, not because of what Richard had done, because of what he himself had done, because he had believed it. He had believed I was the problem, for months, maybe longer. I felt tears filling my eyes, not angry tears, sad tears. The kind that come when someone you love finally sees the truth. You don't have to. Yes, I do. His voice cracked. I should have listened. The room became quiet again. Jennifer started crying harder. Then she looked at me, and I saw the guilt written all over her face. The guilt of every phone call, every question, every moment she doubted me. Mom. Her voice barely came out. I reached for her hand, because despite everything, she was still my daughter. And I knew exactly who deserved the blame. It wasn't sitting beside me. It was sitting at the other end of the table. Richard, the man who had manipulated all of us. Attorney Susan Mitchell's words suddenly echoed in my mind. Keep multiple copies. At the time, I thought she was being cautious. Now I understood, because what was happening wasn't merely a family argument anymore. It was evidence. Evidence of manipulation. Evidence of financial misconduct. Evidence that might eventually matter in ways none of us fully understood yet. Jennifer suddenly turned toward her father. "Did you forge Mom's signature?" The question landed like a bomb. Richard immediately stood. No. The answer came too quickly, too forcefully, too defensively. Nobody missed it. Jennifer repeated herself. "Did you?" "No." Another fast answer. Another weak one. Then Brandon quietly said, "Then why are you nervous?" Richard froze. The observation hit harder than any accusation. Because it was true. He was nervous. Terrified. Actually. And for the first time in years, he couldn't hide it. His hands shook slightly. His breathing had changed. Even his voice sounded different. The room could see it. Everyone could. The illusion was falling apart. Then Jennifer asked the question none of us expected. "Who's Patricia?" Complete silence. Richard looked like someone had punched him. Brandon looked confused. I wasn't. I had been waiting for that question. The name hung in the air. Heavy. Dangerous. Unavoidable. Richard's expression changed instantly. And that alone told everyone exactly how important Patricia was. Jennifer noticed. Brandon noticed. Even before anyone spoke, they noticed. "Who's Patricia?" Jennifer repeated. This time louder. Richard looked trapped. For several seconds he said nothing. Then finally, "A friend." Nobody believed it. Not even slightly. The answer was pathetic, weak, insulting. A friend. After everything. After hotel receipts, after secret meetings, after changed beneficiaries, a friend. Brandon laughed. A short, bitter laugh. The kind that appears when reality becomes too absurd. "You've got to be kidding." Richard didn't respond. Because he had no response left. Every excuse was crumbling. Every explanation sounded ridiculous. Every lie was becoming impossible to maintain. And then something happened that none of us expected. A phone started ringing. Richard's phone. The sound echoed through the silent dining room. Everyone looked down. The screen lit up. Bright. Visible. Impossible to miss. For one horrifying second, nobody moved. Then Jennifer saw the name, and her face turned white. Completely white. She slowly looked up, then back down at the screen, then at her father. The phone continued ringing. The name remained visible. Patricia Bennett. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. Because suddenly, another piece of the truth had arrived, and this time, it had called the house itself. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Richard's phone continued ringing on the table. Patricia Bennett. The name glowed brightly across the screen. Impossible to ignore. Impossible to explain away. For years, Richard had mastered the art of controlling information. Controlling conversations, controlling perceptions, but now his own phone had betrayed him. The call finally stopped. The room remained silent. Jennifer stared at the screen, then slowly looked up at her father. Her eyes were full of tears, but something else had replaced the sadness. Anger. Real anger. The kind that appears when trust dies. Patricia. Richard swallowed. "It's not what you think." The response came automatically, almost reflexively. Jennifer laughed. A short, bitter laugh. Seriously, nobody joined her. Nobody needed to. The absurdity spoke for itself. Brandon folded his arms. Then tell us what it is. Richard looked trapped. For the first time all evening, he genuinely seemed unsure of what to say. His usual confidence had completely disappeared. Every path forward looked dangerous. Every answer created new problems. Every lie risked exposing another. Then the phone rang again. Everyone jumped. Patricia Bennett. Again. This time nobody looked away. Nobody pretended not to notice. Richard immediately reached for the phone. Jennifer grabbed it first. The movement shocked all of us, including Richard. Jennifer, his voice was sharp, warning, authoritative, the voice of a father expecting obedience. For most of her life, that voice worked. Not tonight. Jennifer stared directly at him, then pressed the speaker button, and answered. Hello. The silence that followed lasted only a second. Then a woman's voice filled the dining room. Richard Patricia sounded cheerful, comfortable, completely unaware that she had just entered a disaster. Jennifer didn't answer. Neither did anyone else. Patricia continued. Did everything go okay tonight? My heart started pounding. Every person at the table leaned forward slightly. Listening. Patricia laughed softly. You said once Sheila signed the papers, we could finally move forward. The room froze. Every muscle in my body locked. Across the table, Richard looked as though all the blood had drained from his face. Patricia kept talking, still unaware, still confident, still believing she was speaking privately. I've already talked to the realtor about the house, Jennifer gasped. Brandon's jaw dropped. The house. Our house. The house where we raised our children. The house where I had spent more than 3 decades of my life. Patricia kept talking. Every sentence making things worse. We should probably wait until everything is finalized before we start looking at places in Florida. Florida, a future. A shared future. The future Richard had been planning behind my back. My daughter slowly lowered her head. Tears rolled down her cheeks. Not because Patricia was cruel, because Patricia was accidentally telling the truth Richard had worked so hard to hide. Finally, Patricia noticed the silence. Richard, nothing. Richard, are you there? Jennifer took a shaky breath. No, another pause. Then, this is Jennifer. The silence on the other end became immediate, absolute. Patricia knew. Instantly. Everyone knew. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Patricia whispered, "Oh." One word. One terrified word. Jennifer's voice trembled. How long? Patricia didn't answer. Jennifer repeated herself. How long? More silence. Then, a few years. A few years. The word struck like lightning. Not months. Not recently. Years. I closed my eyes, because somehow that hurt more than I expected. Not because of the affair itself, because it meant the deception had lasted so long. The lies, the manipulation, the planning, all of it stretching back years. Patricia's voice became smaller, less confident. I didn't know things would happen this way. Jennifer laughed bitterly. You mean destroying our family? No response. Brandon suddenly spoke. What papers? Patricia inhaled sharply, as if she realized she had already said too much, but it was too late. Far too late. What papers? Brandon repeated. Patricia hesitated, then made the mistake that destroyed whatever remained of Richard's defense: the ownership transfer documents. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. I watched my son physically recoil, as if he'd been punched. What ownership transfer documents? Patricia realized her mistake. Immediately, the panic entered her voice. I should go. Don't. The word came from me. Quiet. Calm. Steady. Everyone looked at me, including Richard. I looked at the phone, then spoke directly to Patricia. Tell them. Silence. Tell them what he planned. For several seconds, all we heard was breathing. Then Patricia spoke. And with every word, Richard's world collapsed. He told me Sheila was becoming mentally unstable. Jennifer started crying again, harder this time. Patricia continued. He said doctors would eventually confirm it. My stomach twisted. The story, the file, the conversations, the manipulation, everything. Exactly as I suspected. Patricia kept talking. He said once the financial arrangements were complete, he could sell the house. Brandon lowered his head, shaking it slowly, unable to believe what he was hearing, and Patricia wasn't finished. He said the children understood. Jennifer broke, completely. No. The word came out as a sob. No, we didn't. Richard sat frozen, not speaking, not moving, not even attempting to interrupt any more, because there was nothing left to say. Every secret was coming out, one after another. Patricia finally realized the full scope of the disaster. The truth, the recording, the documents, the family hearing everything, and suddenly her tone changed. Richard never told me it was like this. Nobody responded, because nobody cared. Not anymore. After a few more painful moments, Patricia quietly ended the call. The line went dead. The room remained silent. The damage was done. Completely, irreversibly. Jennifer wiped tears from her face, then slowly turned toward her father. I will never forget the look in her eyes. Not anger, not sadness. Disappointment. Profound disappointment. The kind that cannot be repaired easily. The kind that changes relationships forever. You used us. Richard opened his mouth. Nothing came out. You used me. Still nothing. You used Brandon. Silence. You used Mom. The words echoed through the room, and for the first time all evening, Richard had no response, no excuse, no manipulation, no performance, nothing, because every mask had been removed, every lie exposed, every secret revealed. The man sitting at the table was no longer the respected father, no longer the devoted husband, no longer the trustworthy community leader. He was simply Richard Cole, a man who had betrayed his wife, manipulated his children, and spent years building a future on lies. Then Brandon stood, slowly, deliberately. He looked at his father, the man he had admired his entire life. Then he pointed toward the front door and quietly said, "You need to leave." The room went completely still, because everyone understood. The family Richard had spent years controlling was finally choosing a side. And for the first time, it wasn't his. And now that same son was pointing toward the front door, telling him to leave. The irony wasn't lost on any of us, especially Richard. I think everyone needs to calm down. His voice sounded weak, smaller than usual. Gone was the confident banker. Gone was the community leader. Gone was the man who controlled every conversation. This was someone else, someone cornered, someone desperate. Jennifer wiped her eyes. No. Richard looked at her. His expression softened immediately. The familiar performance. The concerned father, the wounded parent, the victim. Jennifer. No, she cut him off. For perhaps the first time in her life, and the hurt on her face nearly broke my heart. You lied to us. Richard opened his mouth. She didn't let him speak. You lied for years. Jennifer, please listen. No. Her voice cracked, but she kept going. You made me think Mom was sick. The room fell silent, because that was the deepest wound of all. Not the affair, not the money, not even the forged signatures. It was the betrayal between parent and child. Richard had weaponized their love, used their trust, manipulated their concern. Jennifer looked devastated. I thought I was helping her. Nobody spoke, because there was nothing to say. She wasn't wrong. She genuinely believed she was helping. Richard had made sure of that. Brandon stood beside his sister. Arms folded tightly across his chest. His face was rigid, controlled, but I knew him. I knew my son, and I could see the anger underneath, the hurt, the disappointment, the humiliation, because he had been manipulated too, and he hated it. Then Richard did something that surprised all of us. He became angry, not explosive, not shouting, something colder, more dangerous. The mask slipped again. I did what I had to do. The room froze. Jennifer blinked. What? Richard stood, slowly, deliberately. Then he looked around the table, at his children, at me, at the family he'd spent years controlling. And suddenly, the charming version of Richard disappeared completely. You don't understand how difficult she has been. I stared at him. Even now, even after everything, he was still blaming me. Still. Jennifer shook her head. Dad, stop. But he couldn't. Maybe he didn't know how. Maybe years of lies had finally become too heavy to carry. Or maybe he realized the truth was already out. Either way, he kept talking. Your mother hasn't trusted me in years. I laughed. The sound surprised even me, because it wasn't happy. It was exhausted. 34 years. And that was his defense. Richard pointed toward me. She went through my office, because you were hiding things. Brandon's voice was sharp, instant, protective. The same son who doubted me months earlier was now defending me. Richard looked shocked, as though he still expected loyalty, still expected obedience, still expected control. He didn't have it anymore. Jennifer stood up. I can't listen to this. She turned towards me. Tears filled her eyes again. I'm so sorry, Mom. The words shattered whatever remained of my composure. I started crying too, because this wasn't victory. Not really. It hurt too much to feel like victory. Watching your children discover the truth isn't satisfying when the truth destroys their hearts. Jennifer walked around the table, then hugged me, tightly, like she used to when she was little, when nightmares woke her up, when she scraped her knee, when she needed her mother. And for the first time in months, I felt my daughter come back to me. I'm sorry I didn't believe you. I wrapped my arms around her and cried, not because she owed me an apology, because I knew how much pain she was carrying. Brandon joined us a moment later, one hand resting on my shoulder. his eyes red, his voice barely above a whisper. I should have listened. I shook my head. No. But he interrupted me. I should have. Nobody spoke for several moments. The room filled only with quiet tears. Then Richard laughed. A short, bitter, broken laugh. Everyone turned toward him. The sound felt wrong, unsettling. Richard looked around the room, at his children standing beside me, at the family unit he no longer controlled, and something inside him finally cracked. You think she's innocent? The anger in his voice startled everyone. Jennifer stepped back. Brandon stiffened. Richard pointed toward me. Do you know how much I've sacrificed? Nobody answered, because nobody cared anymore. Not after everything. Not after the lies. Not after the manipulation. Richard continued anyway. I built this family. The statement echoed through the room. And suddenly I realized something. Richard genuinely believed it. Not that we built it. Not that we created it together. He built it. In his mind, everyone else was supporting cast. Tools. Resources. Assets. Just as he called me useful on the recording. Useful. The word suddenly made perfect sense. Because Richard viewed relationships like transactions. People existed to serve a purpose. And when they stopped serving that purpose, he replaced them. Patricia. The children. Me. Everyone. Brandon took a step forward. You forged Mom's signature. Richard immediately looked away. That was answer enough. But Brandon wasn't finished. You tried to steal her share of everything. Silence. Another answer. Jennifer looked horrified. I can't believe this. Neither could I. Not completely. Even standing there with proof. Even hearing the recording. Part of me still struggled to reconcile this man with the husband I thought I knew. Then Brandon said something that changed the atmosphere completely. I talked to my attorney. Everyone looked at him, including me, when, this afternoon, Richard's face changed. Immediately. Fear. Real fear. For the first time all night. What attorney? Brandon ignored him, looking only at me. I sent him copies of the documents. My heart skipped a beat. Richard looked stunned, genuinely stunned, because for the first time, consequences had entered the room. Not family consequences, legal consequences. Jennifer slowly turned toward her brother. You did. Brandon nodded, then looked directly at Richard. The signatures are fraudulent. Silence. Heavy silence. According to the attorney, if those documents were submitted knowingly, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. Everyone understood, including Richard, especially Richard. The color drained from his face, because suddenly this wasn't a family dispute anymore. It wasn't an argument. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was evidence. Evidence with legal implications. Evidence involving financial fraud. Evidence involving forged documents. And for the first time since I'd known him, Richard looked genuinely afraid of what came next. Then a quiet voice broke the silence. Mine. Why? Everyone looked at me, including Richard. I wiped away tears, then asked again. Why? Not about the affair. Not about Patricia. Not about the money. Why any of it? Why destroy our family? Why spend years lying? Why turn our children against me? Why? For a long moment, Richard said nothing. Then he finally answered. And the truth was far smaller than I expected, far uglier, and far more pathetic. Because after everything, It came down to greed. Why spend years creating a lie instead of simply telling the truth? Richard stood motionless near the dining room table. The confidence that had once defined him was gone. For the first time in 34 years, he looked old. Not physically, emotionally. Like a man exhausted from carrying too many secrets. When he finally answered, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because I wasn't going to lose half of everything. The room went silent. Again. Not because the answer was shocking. Because it was so small. So pathetic. After years of deception, and that was the reason. Money, assets, control, nothing more. Jennifer stared at him in disbelief. You destroyed our family for money. Richard looked away. His silence answered for him. I felt strangely calm. Months earlier, that answer would have shattered me. Now it simply confirmed what I already knew. The man standing before us valued possessions more than people, and that truth had likely existed long before Patricia entered the picture, long before the forged documents, long before the recordings. Perhaps it had always been there, hidden beneath charm and success. The evening ended shortly afterward. Nobody had the energy to continue. Nobody wanted to. Richard gathered a few personal belongings and left the house. Not because he wanted to, because there was nothing left to stay for. As I watched him walk toward his car, I expected to feel victorious. I didn't. I felt sad, deeply sad. Not for the marriage. That had already died. I mourned the illusion. The future I thought I had. The man I thought I married. The family I thought we were. Jennifer stayed the night. So did Brandon. None of us wanted to be alone. Around midnight, we sat together in the kitchen, drinking coffee nobody needed, talking quietly, sometimes crying, sometimes laughing awkwardly, trying to process what had happened. At one point, Jennifer looked at me. I don't know how to forgive myself. My heart broke, because I knew exactly what she meant. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. You were manipulated, but I should have trusted you. Maybe. Tears filled her eyes. But you're here now. She cried again, and so did I. Because healing often begins with honesty, even painful honesty. The following week moved quickly, much faster than I expected. Attorney Susan Mitchell became a regular part of my life. The moment she reviewed the documents and heard the recording, her expression became very serious. She asked careful questions, detailed questions, questions I couldn't fully answer. But one thing became clear almost immediately. The situation was worse than I realized. Several signatures appeared highly questionable. Some financial transfers required further investigation, and Richard's own recorded statements would make it very difficult for him to claim innocence. I wasn't interested in revenge. I never was. I simply wanted protection. Protection for myself. Protection for the assets I had spent decades helping build. Protection from further manipulation. Susan assured me that we would pursue exactly that. Nothing more, nothing less. Meanwhile, word began spreading through our community. Not because I shared details, because secrets rarely stay hidden forever. Especially when they involve people who have spent years building public reputations. Former colleagues started asking questions. Neighbors became distant. Charity organizations quietly removed Richard from leadership positions. The image he had spent decades constructing began to crumble, piece by piece. The strange thing was that I didn't enjoy watching it happen. I truly didn't. Because once upon a time, I had loved that man, even if he no longer existed, even if perhaps he never had. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after the family dinner, I received unexpected news. Patricia Bennett had disappeared, not literally, but effectively. According to mutual acquaintances, she had sold her condominium and moved in with a relative in another state. She stopped returning calls, stopped answering messages, stopped appearing in places she once frequented. In many ways, she vanished. I wasn't surprised. The fantasy she and Richard built together had depended on secrecy. Once exposed, it couldn't survive reality. The future they imagined no longer existed. By the end of the month, I officially filed for legal separation. Signing those documents felt surreal. 34 years, reduced to paperwork. Yet when I placed my signature on the final page, I felt something unexpected. Relief, not happiness. Relief, like someone had finally removed a heavy weight from my chest. The following weeks focused on healing. Something I hadn't done in a very long time. Susan recommended a therapist experienced with emotional manipulation and coercive relationships. At first, I resisted. I didn't think I needed therapy. I thought I simply needed time. I was wrong. The therapist helped me understand things I had never fully recognized. How manipulation develops, how confidence erodes, how people slowly begin doubting their own reality. For the first time, I understood that what happened wasn't weakness. It wasn't stupidity. It wasn't age. It was years of conditioning, years of subtle control, years of emotional erosion, understanding that changed everything, because it allowed me to stop blaming myself. Then something happened that became one of the most meaningful moments of my recovery. While cleaning a closet, I discovered an old box that had belonged to my mother. Most of the contents were ordinary. Photographs, recipes, letters, keepsakes. Then I found an envelope with my name on it. The handwriting was hers. My hands trembled as I opened it. The letter had been written years before her death. I sat on the floor and read every word. Near the end, one passage stopped me cold. Never allow anyone to convince you that your voice doesn't matter. The people who truly love you may disagree with you, but they will never try to erase you. I read those words 3 times. Then 4, then 5, and suddenly I started crying, because my mother had described exactly what happened to me. Not specifically, not literally, but emotionally. Richard hadn't merely lied. He had tried to erase me, erase my credibility, erase my independence, erase my voice. And somehow, even years after her passing, my mother was helping me find it again. That night, I placed the letter beside my bed, where I could see it every morning. A reminder, a lesson, a gift. Because the legal battle wasn't over, the healing wasn't over, the rebuilding wasn't over. But for the first time in a very long while, I wasn't afraid of the future. I was beginning to believe something that Richard spent years trying to take away from me. I was beginning to believe myself. And that changed everything. Greed, after everything, after 34 years of marriage, after raising 2 children together, after building a home, a family, and a life. It came down to greed. That realization stayed with me long after Richard left the house, long after the lawyers became involved, long after the documents were reviewed. Because once you remove the lies, the manipulation, and the excuses. Some truths are surprisingly simple. Richard wanted control. He wanted money, and he wanted a future that didn't include accountability. The months that followed were difficult. Not because I doubted my decisions, because healing is never easy, even when you're doing the right thing, especially then. The legal process moved slowly. Attorney Susan Mitchell guided me through every step, patiently, carefully, professionally. The investigation into the financial documents revealed exactly what we feared. Several signatures were determined to be fraudulent. Multiple transactions raised serious concerns. Certain attempts to transfer control of assets had never been properly authorized. The evidence was overwhelming. Ironically, the recording Richard mocked became one of the strongest pieces of protection I had. The same recording he never thought anyone would hear. The same recording he believed nobody would believe. For once, the truth was louder than his reputation. Jennifer and Brandon remained by my side through everything. The guilt they carried was heavy. I could see it. Sometimes in the way Jennifer looked at me. Sometimes in Brandon's silence. Sometimes in the apologies they still offered months later. But I refused to let them spend the rest of their lives punishing themselves. One Sunday afternoon, several months after the family dinner, all three of us sat on my back porch. The house was quiet, peaceful. The kind of peaceful I hadn't felt in years. Jennifer stared out at the yard, then softly said, "I still feel terrible." I smiled gently. I know. I should have listened. I reached over and squeezed her hand. You were manipulated. So were you. The statement caught me off guard. For a moment, I simply looked at her. Then I realized she was right. Richard manipulated all of us. The difference was only the method. He attacked my confidence. He exploited their trust. Different tools, same goal. Control. That conversation became an important turning point, not just for Jennifer, for me. Because forgiveness isn't only about forgiving others. Sometimes it's about refusing to carry pain longer than necessary. And I was tired of carrying pain. Very tired. A year after everything happened, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I sold the house, not because I had to, because I wanted to. The house held beautiful memories. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, school photos, family dinners, but it also held ghosts, too many of them. Every room reminded me of who I used to be. The woman who doubted herself. The woman who apologized for things she didn't do. The woman who believed silence would keep the peace. I loved her, but I didn't want to remain her forever. So I sold the house and bought something smaller. A cozy cottage near a lake about 40 minutes outside Columbus. Nothing extravagant. Just peaceful. The first morning I woke up there, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching sunlight dance across the water, listening to birds, feeling something unfamiliar. Freedom, not dramatic freedom, not movie scene freedom, quiet freedom. The kind that settles into your chest slowly. The kind you don't fully appreciate until you've lived without it. The following months became some of the most meaningful of my life. For the first time in decades, I started doing things simply because I wanted to. I joined a book club, took painting classes, started walking every morning, read novels for hours without feeling guilty, learned to enjoy my own company. It sounds simple, But after years of living under someone else's control, simple things feel revolutionary. Then something unexpected happened. I was invited to speak at a local women's support group. At first, I declined. The idea terrified me. I wasn't a speaker. I wasn't an expert. I was just a woman whose life had fallen apart. But the organizer persisted. Eventually, I agreed. The evening of the meeting, I stood in front of about 20 women. Most were close to my age. Some older, some younger, each carrying invisible scars of their own. I told my story, not every detail, just enough. The manipulation, the self-doubt, the recording, the moment I finally believed myself again. When I finished, the room was silent. Then one woman started crying, then another, then another. Afterward, several approached me. One woman whispered, "I thought I was the only one." Another said, "You described my marriage exactly." A third hugged me and cried. That night changed my life, because I realized something. The recording didn't just save me. The story didn't just belong to me. There were countless women carrying similar pain. Women who doubted themselves. Women who had been told they were imagining things. Women whose voices had been dismissed for years. And maybe my story could help some of them find theirs. So I kept speaking. Not everywhere. Not constantly. Just enough. Enough to remind people that manipulation often hides behind charm. Enough to remind women that their instincts matter. Enough to remind someone sitting quietly in the back row that they weren't crazy, that they weren't alone, that their voice mattered. 2 years after the family dinner, Jennifer and Brandon organized a small gathering at my cottage. Nothing fancy, just family, food, laughter, grandchildren running around the yard. At one point, I stood near the lake watching the sunset. Jennifer joined me, then Brandon. The three of us stood together quietly, watching the water glow gold beneath the evening sky. Finally, Brandon smiled. "You seem happy." I thought about the question, really thought about it. Then I smiled. "I am?" And for the first time in many years, the answer felt completely true. Because happiness didn't come from winning. It didn't come from exposing Richard. It didn't come from the legal outcome. Happiness came from something much simpler. I trusted myself again. The woman who once sat crying in her car because nobody believed her was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone wiser, someone who finally understood her own worth. Sometimes I think about that night at the dining room table, the night Richard looked at me and said, "No one would believe you." He was wrong. Not because of the recording, not because of the evidence, because eventually I learned the most important lesson of all. Before anyone else could believe me, I had to believe myself. And once I did, everything changed. If there's one lesson I hope you take from my story, it's this. Never allow someone else's version of you to become louder than your own voice. Manipulation rarely begins with obvious cruelty. It often starts with small moments, tiny doubts, little corrections, subtle comments that make you question your memory, your judgment, and eventually your worth. Over time, those moments can become a cage. But no matter your age, your circumstances, or how long you've been silenced, your voice still matters. Trust your instincts. Pay attention when something feels wrong. And remember that being kind does not mean accepting mistreatment. Being loyal does not mean abandoning yourself. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply say, "I know what I experienced, and I will not let anyone tell me otherwise. Healing is possible. Trust can be rebuilt. Life can begin again, even after heartbreak. And sometimes your greatest strength appears only after everything you depended on falls apart." If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment when someone tried to make you doubt yourself? What would you have done in Sheila's situation? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story may help someone else feel less alone. And if you enjoy emotional storytelling like this, don't forget to subscribe and join our community. Thank you for spending your time here with me, and wherever you're watching from, I hope you remember one thing: your voice matters.